In the bustling heart of one of America's busiest airports, a quiet confrontation would ignite a storm no one saw coming. A torn passport, an everyday object shattered in an instant, would unravel a web of prejudice, corruption, and hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface of the skies we trust. This is not just a story about one woman's courage or one gate agent's reckless act. It is a revelation of a broken system and the relentless fight to hold it accountable. What happened next would change lives and challenge everything we believe about safety and justice. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps give light to voices that deserve to be seen and heard. Reed carried with her the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that only follows a high-stakes mission successfully completed. For the past 10 days, she had been living out of a sterile hotel room in Miami, orchestrating a covert audit of airport security protocols. The project, codenamed Operation Safe Skies, was entirely her creation, an intricate test designed to expose vulnerabilities within the nation's aviation defenses from the inside out. The work was relentless, unglamorous, and demanding, endless hours of sharp observation, pretending ignorance, and filing meticulous reports late into the night. Now, all that separated her from the comfort of her own bed in Washington, D.C., was a 2-hour flight. She deliberately dressed down for the journey home. Simple gray joggers, a well-worn Howard University sweatshirt, and worn sneakers. Her hair was pulled back into a neat, tight bun. After a week spent slipping into countless personas, the flustered tourist, the demanding business traveler, the nervous first-time flyer, she craved invisibility above all else. Her first-class ticket was a modest but well-earned reward for the intensity of the assignment, promising a wider seat, a sliver of peace, and the mental space to decompress. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport thrummed with its usual symphony of organized chaos. The low rumble of rolling suitcases, distant boarding announcements chiming, and the murmur of thousands of conversations weaving into a singular, complex hum. Ebony Reed's alias moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a seasoned traveler. Her backpack rested casually on one shoulder, holding only a laptop, a novel, and a thick file containing her preliminary findings. Documents that would soon send ripples through the aviation industry. She reached Gate B32, where Ascend Air Flight 1142 to Reagan National was slated to board in 20 minutes. The gate area was already bustling, a mosaic of humanity, a family wrangling 3 overexcited children, a cluster of businessmen clad in matching navy suits, an elderly couple quietly sharing a bag of pretzels. And then there was Brenda, the gate agent. Her name tag spelled out Brenda in sharp corporate font. She was a woman in her late 40s, with a helmet of solid blonde hair and a thin mouth set in what seemed a permanent frown. Brenda moved with a theatrical sense of self-importance, her fingers striking the keyboard with unnecessary force, her voice sharp and condescending as she addressed a passenger's question. Ebony watched her closely, unable to switch off her investigator's instincts. Brenda's behavior was a study in contrasts. When a smiling, rosy-cheeked white family asked about their seats, Brenda transformed into a beacon of sugary sweetness, cooing "sweetheart" to the children and assuring the parents everything was perfect. But when an elderly Indian man politely inquired if the flight was on time, Brenda barely glanced at him before snapping, "It'll board when it boards. Listen for the announcement." That familiar pang of weary frustration settled in Ebony's chest. A textbook case of what she called authority bias, when someone in uniform wields a sliver of power to reinforce their own prejudices, building a hierarchy where none should exist. This human flaw was one of the many cracks in the security system, small enough to be overlooked but large enough to be exploited. Then the pre-boarding announcement crackled over the speakers. First-class passengers were invited to begin boarding, with boarding passes and government-issued IDs ready for inspection. Ebony stepped into the short line, calm but alert. When her turn came, she placed her phone, displaying the digital boarding pass on the scanner, then handed over her United States passport. Brenda's eyes flicked between the boarding pass, Ebony's simple sweatshirt, sneakers, and then back up to her face. The fake warmth Brenda had shown the family evaporated, replaced by a flat, challenging stare. "A passport for a domestic flight?" Brenda's voice dripped with suspicion. "It's my primary form of government ID. It's valid," Ebony replied evenly. She had used it all week without issue. It was standard practice. Brenda took the dark blue booklet, flipping through it dismissively. Holding it up to the light, she squinted at the photo. "This picture doesn't look much like you." Eddie remained still. The photo was 5 years old, but unmistakably her. "My face has changed less than you'd think," she said lightly. Brenda laughed derisively. "Funny. You look younger here. Happier." She tapped a manicured nail on the data page. "Ebony Reed, Doctor of what? Philosophy? Let me guess. Art history?" Each microaggression landed like a paper cut, piling up one by one. Ebony recognized the pattern. A script she'd witnessed countless times, both in her work and in her life. Her credentials questioned, honesty insinuated. Her very presence challenged in a space Brenda believed she didn't belong. "My doctorate is in aeronautical engineering," Ebony said, her voice shifting from light to professional clarity. "Is there a problem with the document, or may I board the plane?" The blunt question seemed to unsettle Brenda. Her lips thinned into a razor line. "There's a problem with me believing this is a legitimate document," she hissed, conspiratorial yet loud enough for those behind Ebony to hear. "First class, a brand new passport. It just doesn't add up." The passport wasn't new. Its cover was pristine, because Ebony treated her federal documents with the utmost care. The accusation hung thick and ugly in the air. The people waiting behind Ebony began to shift uncomfortably. "I assure you it's legitimate," Ebony said, her patience thinning. "It was issued by the U.S. Department of State. You can verify it using your system. I'd like to get to my seat." Leaning forward, a cruel smirk flickered across Brenda's lips. "Or maybe you bought it. People like you can be very resourceful. I've seen it all, fake IDs, fake credit cards." She looked Ebony up and down again. "Fake everything." Ebony's blood ran cold. The insult was no longer veiled. It was a direct racist attack delivered under the harsh fluorescent lights of a bustling public airport, masquerading as corporate authority. She knew she had to de-escalate, to follow the very protocols she had written herself for handling difficult personnel. But she was only human, and the exhaustion, mingled with the sheer audacity of Brenda's attack, was beginning to fray her composure. "Ma'am," Ebony's voice hardened into steel, "you are making serious, unfounded accusations. Scan the document, verify it, or call your supervisor. But you will not stand here and slander me." Brenda seemed to savor the confrontation. This was exactly the moment she'd been waiting for. Holding Ebony's passport up between her thumb and forefinger like a despised relic, she hissed, "Oh, I'll do more than that. I'm going to resolve this situation right now." Then, with a sudden, sharp twist of her wrist, Brenda ripped the passport in two. The sound was shockingly loud amid the relative quiet of the boarding area. A soft, ripping noise that seemed to suck the air from the space around them. The two halves of the blue booklet, bearing Ebony's pristine photo and the national seal, fluttered from Brenda's fingers and landed on the counter with quiet finality. For a moment there was absolute silence. Passengers froze, mouths agape. Brenda stood tall, chest puffed out, wearing a triumphant look as if she had just vanquished some great evil. Ebony looked down at the torn pieces of her passport, the document that had carried her across the world, the symbol of her citizenship, the proof of her identity, now lying in ruins. In that moment, the weary traveler, the invisible woman in sweats, ceased to exist. Rising from that broken identity was Ebony Reed, the federal investigator, the architect of Operation Safe Skies. Exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of cold, crystalline focus. Brenda had no idea what she'd just done. She thought she had won a petty battle against someone she deemed unworthy. She couldn't have been more wrong. She had just started a war. The silence that followed the passport's destruction was profound. A vacuum where the airport's normal hum should have been. Every eye at gate B32 was locked on the scene at the boarding counter. The businessmen stopped their hushed conversations. The family's children fell silent, their boisterous energy instantly extinguished. A young woman a few people back in the economy line instinctively raised her phone, its camera a small, unblinking witness. Brenda seemed to bask in the attention, crossing her arms with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. In her mind, she had exposed a fraud and protected the integrity of her airline. She was the hero of her own small, ugly story. Ebony did not look at Brenda. She did not shout or cry. Her gaze was fixed on the two halves of her passport lying on the worn countertop, the crisp tear edges of visceral wound. She saw the severed eagle on the Great Seal of the United States, a symbol of the nation she served, now bisected by an act of petty malice. Slowly, Ebony raised her eyes and met Brenda's triumphant stare. Brenda expected hysteria. She expected tears, a tirade, a meltdown, to justify her actions. What she got was far more unnerving: absolute stillness. Ebony's face was a mask of calm control, but her eyes burned with a new intensity, sharp, penetrating like a physical force. The air crackled between them. "You have just destroyed a United States federal document," Ebony said quietly, almost conversationally, but her words carried unnerving clarity through the silent gate area. It was not the voice of a victim, it was the voice of a judge. That is a federal offense, Title 18, Section 1543 of the U.S. Code, mutilation or alteration of a passport. It carries a penalty of up to 25 years in prison. For the first time, Brenda's smirk faltered. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She'd expected accusations of racism, not a precise citation of federal law. "It was fake," Brenda stammered, her bravado sounding hollow. "I was within my rights as an agent of this airline." "You were not," Ebony cut her off, her voice level but edged with unyielding authority. "You had a procedure you were trained to follow. You are to use the document scanner and UV light system to verify its features. If doubts remain, you must contact a supervisor and airport security. At no point does that procedure give you, a private citizen employed by a corporation, the right to unilaterally destroy federal property." The question hung in the air, calm yet piercing. "Why didn't you follow procedure?" The young woman with the phone stepped subtly closer. "I used my discretion," Brendan said, her voice gaining a desperate, defensive edge. "The safety and security of this flight is my responsibility. Your responsibility is to follow the law and your company's regulations," Ebony countered, stepping deliberately away from the counter to claim space and command the situation. She reached slowly into her backpack, her movements precise and unhurried. Brenda flinched, expecting a weapon. Instead, Ebony pulled out her phone. She didn't dial 911. Instead, she tapped a single contact on her favorites list. As the phone rang, Ebony spoke, her voice still directed at Brenda but intended for the captive audience now watching in stunned silence. "Let me tell you what you've done, Brenda. You didn't just break the law, you have, with your reckless discretion, compromised the very security you claim to protect. An individual who allows personal bias to dictate their actions and escalate situations so recklessly is not a guardian of safety, they are a liability. A massive, gaping liability." The phone clicked on the other end. Ebony's tone shifted, softening into brisk professional urgency. "Director Evans, this is Reed. Apologies for the direct call. I'm at Hartsfield-Jackson, Gate B32. I'm invoking a code black on Operation Safe Skies. There is an active security breach and willful destruction of federal property by an Ascend Air agent. I need TSA and the FBI's airport liaison team on site immediately. Also, get me a direct line to Ascend Air's legal department at corporate headquarters. Inform them they are about to be in breach of their operating certificate." The words Operation Safe Skies and the mention of the FBI sent a ripple of shock through the onlookers. The businessmen exchanged raised eyebrows, Brenda's face drained of color, shifting from smug to uncertain to a pale mask of disbelief. "No, you're lying," Brenda whispered, the words catching in her throat. "You're nobody." Evie ended her call and fixed her gaze on Brenda. The mask of the weary traveler was gone, completely burned away by the fire of purpose. Now she was every inch the federal officer. "My name," she declared, her voice resonating with authority, "is Ebony Reed. I am the senior field inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of National Security and Incident Response. The operation I have led for the past 10 days is a national audit of your airline's compliance with federal security mandates. Your actions here today, your profiling, your blatant disregard for protocol, and your criminal destruction of my credentials have not merely inconvenienced a passenger. You have provided a live, documented, and frankly spectacular example of exactly the kind of systemic failure we are here to identify and eradicate." She paused deliberately, letting her words settle into the stunned silence around her. "So, to answer my earlier question, Brenda, why didn't you follow procedure? Was it inadequate training? Or was it something else?" Brenda was speechless. Her mind swirled with denial and panic. This couldn't be happening. The woman in the college sweatshirt, the one she had dismissed as a fraud, could not be a high-level government agent. It had to be a trick, a bluff. Just then, a harried-looking man in a slightly too tight suit hurried toward the gate. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. His name tag identified him as Frank Miller, the station supervisor. "Brenda, what did you do? We have a flight to board." Brenda turned to him, eyes wide with desperation. "Frank, this woman was trying to board with a fake passport. It was a cheap forgery. I confiscated it." She gestured vaguely at the 2 torn pieces on the counter, avoiding the fact that she had been the one to rip it apart. Frank looked from Brendan's panicked face to Ebony's icy calm one. His default was to back his employee, smooth things over, and get the plane out on time. That was his job. Delays cost money. "Ma'am," he began in a practiced, placating tone, "I'm sure we can sort this out if there's an issue with your ID." "Your time to sort this out has passed, Mr. Miller," Ebony said, her eyes flicking to his name tag. "Your employee has committed a felony. Your airline is now under active investigation by the FAA, effective immediately. Flight 1142 will not be departing. This gate is now a federal investigation scene. Nothing," she said, sweeping her gaze over the counter, "is to be touched." As if on cue, 2 uniformed airport police officers appeared at the end of the jet bridge, their expression serious. They were followed by 2 more individuals in sharp, dark suits, moving with the unmistakable confidence of federal agents. The airport's usual hum returned, but now layered with the crackle of police radios and the urgent murmurs of the crowd. Brenda looked at the approaching officers, then at the torn passport halves, then at Ebony's unyielding face. The reality crashed down on her like a tidal wave of raw horror. The smugness, the power, the vindictive pleasure, it all evaporated, replaced by primal fear. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had ended her career. She had destroyed her life. All within 5 minutes, starting with a sneer and ending with the soft, tearing sound of her own ruin. The arrival of law enforcement flipped a switch at gate B32. The scene shifted from a shocking spectacle into a formal proceeding. The 2 airport police officers, stern and professional, immediately established a perimeter. "Folks, we're going to need you to clear the area," one announced, voice brooking no argument. "Please step back from the gate." The passengers, once captive audience, shuffled backward, murmuring softly. They were no longer witnesses. They were bystanders to an official incident. The young woman who had been filming lowered her phone, but didn't stop recording, letting it hang by her side, its lens still drinking in every moment. 2 plainclothes FBI agents approached Ebony directly, bypassing the crowd. One was a tall man with a calm demeanor, the other a shorter woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Reed?" the man asked, voice low and respectful. "This is Agent Davis." "This is Agent Chen. We got the call from Director Evans. What's the situation?" Before Ebony could answer, Frank stepped forward, face a mask of bewildered indignation. "Hold on. Who's in charge here? This is an Ascend Air gate. This is my station. This woman," he gestured at Ebony, voice rising, is making threats and disrupting our operation." Agent Chen slowly turned to Frank, utterly unimpressed. "Sir," she said flatly, "the moment a federal crime is committed on airport property, jurisdiction shifts. Right now, we are in charge. Please step back and do not interfere." Frank's mouth opened and closed silently. The corporate rulebook he lived by was shredding before his eyes. His authority, wielded with self-importance within the terminal, meant nothing here. He was out of his depth. A middle manager caught in a riptide of federal power. Ebony addressed the agents, tone all business. "Davies, Agent Chen, thank you for your prompt response. The subject," she nodded toward Brendan, now visibly trembling, "is an Ascend Air gate agent. She refused to accept my valid U.S. passport for a domestic flight. After a series of unprofessional and biased comments, she deliberately destroyed the document." She pointed at the torn passport halves on the counter. "That is evidence. I need it collected and preserved." "The subject's name is Brenda, surname unknown at this time. The station supervisor is Frank Miller." Agent Davies nodded, pulling nitrile gloves from his pocket. Carefully, he used tweezers to pick up the torn passport pieces and placed them in an evidence bag. The simple procedural act seemed to seal Brenda's fate more than any argument could. "It's no longer a dispute," Ebony continued, her mind like a finely tuned machine cataloging every step. "I need the gate's security footage pulled immediately from all angles, before anyone can accidentally delete it. I also want this gate's employee logs for the last 48 hours, and the airline's official protocol for verifying passenger identification." "Consider it done," Agent Chen said, already speaking quietly into her wrist-mounted communicator, relaying the orders. Brenda watched it all unfold as if trapped in a nightmare. The woman she'd dismissed and humiliated was now directing federal agents with absolute command. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been violently inverted. "Frank," she whimpered, turning to her supervisor, her last hope, "do something. Tell them I was just doing my job. I thought it was fake. I was protecting the flight." Frank looked at her, then at the stone-faced agents, then at Ebony. His mind raced with the calculus of self-preservation. His instinct to protect Brenda warred with his desire to save his own skin, and the latter was winning. "Brenda, what exactly happened here?" he asked, voice cautious, stripped of earlier bluster. He was no longer her defender, but an investigator, trying to keep safe distance from the explosion. "She was being difficult," Brenda stammered, scrambling for a justification less petty and prejudiced than her true motives. Her story didn't add up. "First class, but dressed like that, it was suspicious," Ebony overheard her say. She turned sharply, gaze locking onto Brenda. "Dressed like that?" she repeated, sharp as shattered glass. "Please clarify for the record, Brenda. What about my attire did you find suspicious? Was it my university sweatshirt? Or was it simply that a black woman was wearing it in the first-class line?" The question landed like a precision strike, laying bare the ugly truth for all to see. Brenda paled even further. "No, it wasn't that. I wouldn't—" Ebony pressed relentlessly. "You wouldn't judge a passenger based on their race. Your actions and your own words suggest otherwise. And I suspect your employment history will corroborate." Turning to Agent Chen, Ebony made a formal request. "I want to see every formal and informal complaint ever filed against her by Ascend Air's HR." A small, strangled gasp escaped Brenda's lips. Memories flooded her mind. Mrs. Garcia from last Christmas, whose son filed a complaint after Brenda refused to let her board with her walker until every other passenger had boarded. The young Muslim man she had singled out for extra screening 3 times in a row. The countless eye rolls, sighs, and dismissive remarks she had made to people who didn't look or sound like her. Frank had always buried those complaints, smoothing things over and telling Brenda to be more careful. He had enabled her. Now, all those little acts of malice were about to be unearthed and put on display under the harsh light of a federal investigation. At that moment, Captain Hayes, the distinguished pilot of Flight 1142 with silver hair, made his way up the jet bridge, drawn by the commotion. He took in the scene: police, federal agents, Brenda's ashen-faced presence, and Frank. "Frank, what in God's name is happening here? We have a full plane waiting to depart." "The flight's been grounded, Captain," Agent Davies stated flatly. Captain Hayes stared at him, incredulous. "A crime scene? Over what?" Ebony answered without hesitation. "Your gate agent assaulted a federal officer performing her duties." A slight reframing. Assaulting an officer by destroying her credentials, but technically true, and deliberately chosen for impact. The captain's eyes widened as he looked at Brenda with dawning horror. The entire flight crew's fate was tied to the airline's performance. An incident like this, a federal investigation, launched on the spot, was catastrophic. It meant audits, interviews, and a black mark on everyone involved. "My apologies, ma'am," he said directly to Ebony, voice respectful. "On behalf of the crew, I assure you this is not the standard of service we aspire to." Ebony nodded, accepting the diplomatic statement. "Your professionalism is noted, Captain, but the standard of service is no longer the primary issue. We have now moved on to matters of federal compliance and criminal conduct." She turned back to Brenda, who looked ready to collapse. The fight was gone, the bravado a distant memory. All that remained was the crumbling facade of a bully who had finally met someone who could fight back, not with fists, but with the full crushing weight of the United States government. "Brenda," Ebony said, her voice dropping to an eerily calm, almost gentle tone, "you will be escorted to a secure interview room. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly advise you to use it until you have legal counsel. You're going to need it." The words hung heavy, a final, devastating verdict. The script had flipped, roles reversed. Brenda, the queen of Gate B32, was no longer in control. She was now a subject, a defendant, a case file. Ebony Reed, the woman in gray joggers, held the pen. The transition from the bustling gate area to the sterile interview room was swift and disorienting for Brenda. One moment she was surrounded by familiar sights and sounds. The next, she sat on a hard plastic chair in a windowless beige room, the only furniture a metal table bolted to the floor and 3 chairs. Agent Chen sat opposite her, folder and pen in hand. Agent Davies stood silently by the door. The air was thick with the scent of institutional cleaners and stale regret. Brenda's mind scrambled in panic. This had to be a misunderstanding, a colossal overreaction. She was a good employee, 22 years with Ascend Air, climbing from baggage handler to coveted lead gate agent. She had seniority. She had Frank's protection. This couldn't be happening. "I want to call my husband," she said, voice thin and trembling. "And I want to talk to Frank." "You will have an opportunity to make a phone call," Agent Chen replied neutrally, clicking her pen. "Mr. Miller is currently in another room giving his own statement. For now, I have a few preliminary questions." She opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet with Brenda's employee photo clipped at the top. "Full name for the record: Brenda S. Kowalski." "Yes, Brendan," Agent Chen said, making a small check mark. "You have been the lead gate agent at this station for 7 years?" "Yes." "In your 2 decades with Ascend Air, how many times have you received training on the Passenger Identification and Verification Protocol, also known as PIV?" "I don't know the exact number. Every year we have refreshers." "And what does that protocol instruct you to do if you suspect a passenger's ID is fraudulent?" Brenda's throat went dry. "We're supposed to use the verification equipment, the UV light. And if doubts remain, call a supervisor or airport security." "And did you use the verification equipment on Reed's passport?" "No," Brenda admitted. "The equipment was right there, built into her counter. It would have taken 5 seconds." "We're not." "Because I just had a feeling it looked off. The way she was dressed, her attitude. It was all wrong. I was being proactive about security." Agent Chen's face remained impassive, but her eyes were sharp. "So you substituted a federally mandated security protocol with a feeling? A feeling based on what you described to your supervisor as this passenger being dressed like that?" "It wasn't just that. She was arrogant," Brenda said, grasping for justification. challenging my authority? Is it your understanding that a passenger asking you to do your job constitutes a challenge to your authority? Agent Chen countered smoothly, making another note. Let's move on to the document itself. You stated you believed it was a cheap forgery. What specific elements of the passport led you to that conclusion? Was the microprinting on the data page flawed? Was the holographic image of the eagle incorrect? Did the binding fail to meet federal standards? Brenda stared blankly, her defenses crumbling. She didn't know anything about the intricate security features of a passport. She had glanced at the photo and the name and made a snap judgment. In her 22 years, she had never truly studied those security protocols. I didn't need to, she mumbled weakly. It just looked fake. The weakness of her excuse echoed painfully in the sterile room. To be clear, Agent Chen summarized, her voice cutting sharply through Brenda's fog of panic. With no technical basis, you ignored your training, profiled a passenger based on her appearance and race, and then, when questioned, committed a felony by destroying the very document you were tasked to inspect. Is that an accurate summary of events? The plain truth struck Brenda like a physical blow. She felt a wave of nausea rise. I want a lawyer, she whispered. A wise decision, Agent Chen replied, closing the folder and standing. You will be formally processed by airport police. The U.S. Attorney's Office will be in touch regarding federal charges. As Agent Davies escorted a stunned and sobbing Brenda from the room, Ebony sat in the station supervisor's cluttered office with Frank Miller. The space was messy, adorned with dusty awards for on-time departures and photos of Frank shaking hands with airline executives. Ebony occupied his chair behind the desk. Frank perched nervously on the edge of a visitor's chair. The power reversal was absolute. Agent Davies handed Ebony the initial printouts she had requested. Gate security footage synced to an iPad and a thin file, Brenda Kowalski's complaint history. Ebony began, her voice calm and measured. I've reviewed your employee's file. In the last 5 years alone, there have been 14 formal complaints lodged against Ms. Kowalski. 9 from passengers of color, 4 from passengers with disabilities, and 1 from a passenger appearing to be of Middle Eastern descent. Frank shifted uneasily. We get complaints all the time. It's the nature of customer service. People get upset when they miss flights. Oh, I'm not talking about missed flights, Ebony said, eyes narrowing. I'm talking about a complaint from Mr. David Chen, who stated that Miss Kowalski loudly asked if he spoke English when he presented a valid New York driver's license. I'm talking about Aisha Sharma, who alleges Ms. Kowalski lost her seat assignment for her and her 2 children after she requested a child's meal. I'm talking about a retired Army sergeant, a double amputee, who claims Ms. Kowalski told him he was holding up the line and should have requested wheelchair assistance, even though he was perfectly capable of walking with his prosthetics. She pushed the file across the desk. And on every single one of these, Mr. Miller, I see your signature. Frank's face paled. Action taken? Ebony pressed. I counseled her, Frank stammered, sweat beading on his brow. I told her to be more careful with her words, to treat everyone with respect. Yet the pattern continued. It escalated, Ebony said firmly. It went from verbal insults to deliberate obstruction, culminating today in a criminal act. What you call counseling, Mr. Miller, the FAA calls gross negligence. You were not managing an employee. You were enabling a known liability. She leaned forward. You cultivated a culture at this gate where prejudice was permissible, as long as the planes left on time. You are as culpable in this as she is. Frank's face, already pale, turned ash gray. That's not true. I'm a good manager. A good manager, Ebony replied, leaning closer, does not have an employee who feels empowered to rip up a passenger's passport in front of 50 people. A good manager would have identified this pattern of behavior and removed the threat. You didn't. You buried it, and now it has buried you. She stood and moved to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. Your airline's operating certificate is contingent on adherence to federal law and FAA security directives. Those directives include provisions against discriminatory practices because they create volatile, unpredictable security risks. You and your star employee have provided us with a textbook case study. The FAA will launch a full top-to-bottom audit of the entire Atlanta hub effective immediately. Every log, every employee file, every procedure will be scrutinized. We're going to put your operation under a microscope, Mr. Miller. And I suspect we're going to find a lot more than just one rogue gate agent. Frank stared at her, his world unraveling. The awards on his wall seemed to mock him. His career, built on cutting corners and looking the other way, was about to be dismantled. Ebony walked out, leaving him alone in the cluttered office. The silence was broken only by the frantic, panicked thumping of his own heart. The unraveling had begun, and it was going to be faster and more painful than he could ever imagine. Ebony Reed's promise to put Ascend Air's Atlanta hub under a microscope was no threat. It was a statement of fact. Within hours, what began with a torn passport at Gate B32 had metastasized into a full-scale federal audit. The FAA moved with a bureaucratic speed reserved for genuine emergencies, descending on Hartsfield-Jackson International. They were not the usual clipboard and checklist auditors. This was the National Security and Incident Response Team, the sharp edge of the spear. Ebony established a command center in a corporate conference room commandeered from Ascend Air. The space quickly filled with laptops, secure servers, and a hand-picked team of investigators known for their ruthlessness in sniffing out non-compliance. They were forensic accountants, NTSB investigators, and data security analysts, the kind of people airlines dread facing. The investigation spiraled out from Brenda Kowalski like ripples in a pond. Her work computer was imaged, her email server seized. Among the trove of emails discovered were exchanges between her and Frank Miller, peppered with coded reassurances. "Don't worry about the Chen guy, I handled it." One of Frank's messages read, "Just try to keep it less obvious next time, lol." That lol was a final nail in his coffin. But Brenda was only the loose thread. As Ebony's team pulled on it, the entire Atlanta station's fabric began to unravel. The audit of employee files, poorly guarded by Frank, revealed Brenda's case was not an anomaly, but the worst among many. Other employees showed disturbing patterns. A baggage handling supervisor who repeatedly lost luggage for passengers with African or Middle Eastern-sounding names. A ticketing agent who consistently assigned minority families to middle seats even on empty flights. These were small acts of degradation. Paper cuts of prejudice dismissed by management, obsessed solely with metrics like on-time departures. "This isn't a bad apple problem," Ebony declared during a team briefing 2 days into the audit, standing before a whiteboard cluttered with diagrams and flowcharts linking names and incidents. "It's an orchard problem." The culture here, fostered by Miller and his predecessors, is one of willful blindness. Compliance is treated as a suggestion, not a mandate. Profit and speed come first. Everything else, including security and basic human dignity, comes second. The most damning discovery came from maintenance logs. An analyst cross-referencing parts inventory with flight records found discrepancies, small at first but undeniably systemic. Ascend Air's Atlanta station was cutting corners. They extended the service life of non-critical parts beyond manufacturer recommendations, falsified inspection reports, and signed off on checks that never happened. They uncovered Flight 819's case from 3 months prior, a Seattle-bound flight forced to make an emergency landing in Denver due to cabin pressure sensor failure. Officially, Frank Miller's report blamed an unforeseeable parts malfunction. The FAA audit revealed the truth. The sensor was on its 3rd life extension, 2 beyond legal limits. The inspection report was signed by a mechanic who was, according to payroll records, vacationing in the Bahamas on the inspection date. Frank Miller had not only ignored racism, he actively participated in a cover-up endangering hundreds of lives. The torn passport was no longer the primary crime. It was the key that unlocked a vault of systemic corruption. Ebony sat down with Captain Hayes, the pilot of the grounded Flight 1142, along with his crew. Angry, embarrassed, and terrified for his career, he listened as Ebony began, professional but compassionate. "I've reviewed your record. It's exemplary. 25 years with no blemishes. That's why it's hard to believe you were unaware of the toxic culture here." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "My job is in the cockpit, Reed. I fly the plane. I have to trust my ground crew and station managers to do their jobs. Trust is not a control," Ebony countered. "Did you notice anything during pre-flight checks? Rushed maintenance sign-offs, overstressed crew, or complaints about understaffing?" He hesitated, torn between loyalty to his team and responsibility for passenger safety. "There have been whispers," he admitted, "management pushing for faster turnarounds, pressure not to delay flights over minor issues. We're told to use discretion, but I never saw anything compromising safety." "And Brenda Kowalski?" Ebony pressed. A deep sigh escaped the captain. Everyone knew about Brenda. "We called her the gatekeeper. She had favorites. If you were on her good side, boarding was smooth. If not, it wasn't. We just stayed out of her way. Fighting her and involving Frank was easier." "So you were aware of her behavior," Ebony concluded, "and you and others chose to ignore it for convenience." "This," Ebony stated firmly, "is complicity. It's the soil where people like Brenda and Frank thrive." The words hit Hayes like a blow. He'd thought of himself as a man of integrity, but Ebony showed him integrity is an active choice, not a passive state. He and many others had failed. The investigation now exposed an insidious rot, a cancer festering when profit eclipses people, accountability is sacrificed for convenience, and prejudice is ignored, allowing bigger crimes to grow. Ebony surveyed the mountain of evidence, falsified logs, complaint histories, damning emails. It all began with one ugly assumption about another woman's place in the world. Bigotry wasn't just a social evil, it was a direct threat to aviation safety and security. Left untreated, it spreads like a disease. The consequences came not in a thunderclap, but a series of targeted lightning strikes. The final report from Operation Safe Skies, with Ascendair's Atlanta hub as its grim centerpiece, was a masterclass in methodical destruction. Leaked strategically to a major news outlet by Ebony's superior, Director Evans, the story couldn't be buried. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Brenda Kowalski and the entire airline. The karma was swift and absolute. Fired by Ascendair within an hour of the scandal breaking, Brenda was arrested the next day. The image of her being led from her suburban home in handcuffs, her face a crumpled mask of disbelief, became the visual icon of the outrage. Charged with destruction of a federal document, the U.S. attorney, fueled by public outcry and the mountain of evidence documenting her discriminatory practices, added civil rights violations to the indictment. Her reckless assault on Ebony Reed would cost her years behind bars. And her legal defense crumbled when Frank Miller, desperate for leniency, agreed to testify against her. He detailed years of so-called counseling that were little more than conspiratorial pats on the back. Miller's fate was in many ways worse. He too was fired and faced federal charges, not just for the passport incident but for falsifying safety records. The FAA made an example of him. They didn't just want him out. They wanted to ensure he could never work in aviation again. His name became synonymous with managerial negligence, facing decades in prison for endangering hundreds of lives with falsified inspections. He accepted a plea deal that landed him a multi-year federal sentence. The man who climbed the corporate ladder died by it, his fall as spectacular as it was deserved. But the true reckoning was reserved for Ascendair. The FAA hit the airline with one of the largest fines in its history, a staggering figure that made Wall Street analysts gasp. The penalty wasn't merely punitive, it was prescriptive. A significant portion of the funds was earmarked for a complete overhaul of the airline's training, compliance, and hiring practices, all to be monitored by a federal court-appointed overseer for 5 years. Ebony Reed herself helped write the settlement terms. The airline's stock plummeted as passengers boycotted flights. The PR nightmare was relentless. The story of the racist gate agent who tore up a passport became a national cautionary tale. Ascendair, once known for budget-friendly travel, was now synonymous with prejudice and corruption. Forced into a humiliating apology tour, Their CEO appeared on national television, his face a grimace of forced contrition. The young woman who had filmed the incident became a minor celebrity. Her video was broadcast on every news channel, a clear, damning record of Brenda's malice. Praised for her quick thinking and lauded as an example of citizen journalism, she later received a quiet, personal note of thanks from Ebony. 6 months later, Ebony Reed stood at a podium in a congressional hearing room on Capitol Hill. No longer clad in undercover sweats, she wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit. Her demeanor was confident. Her voice rang clear and strong throughout the chamber. Behind her, a large screen displayed a high-resolution image of her ripped passport, the two halves a stark symbol of a broken system. The events at Hartsfield-Jackson, she told the Senate committee, were not the result of one employee's bad day. They were the inevitable consequence of a corporate culture that tolerated bigotry, prioritized speed over safety, and ignored the fundamental truth: security is compromised the moment we make assumptions based on race, religion, or appearance. The actions of Ms. Kowalski were not just a personal insult, Ebony continued. They were an affront to every citizen who trusts us to keep them safe. They were a direct threat to the integrity of our national aviation system. She detailed the audit's findings, the systemic rot her team uncovered, and the concrete steps underway to repair it. Speaking with passion and precision, every word backed by mountains of irrefutable evidence, Ebony was no longer merely an investigator. She was a reformer, a force for change. After the hearing, as she packed her briefcase, a young African-American congressional aide approached her, eyes shining with admiration. "Reed," the aide said, voice full of emotion, "thank you for not backing down. Thank you for what you did." Ebony offered a small, genuine smile. She thought back to the humiliation at the gate, the cold fury that had fueled her, and the long, exhausting months since. "I just did my job," she replied, stepping out into the bright Washington sunlight. She felt a profound, weary satisfaction. The karma that had struck Brenda, Frank, and Ascend Air wasn't mystical or magical. It was methodical, procedural, the simple, powerful consequence of a system finally forced to hold the corrupt accountable. It was the hard-earned result of one woman refusing to be invisible, and in doing so, ensuring the ugly rot she exposed would finally be brought into the light. The story of Ebony Reed and Brenda, the gate agent, is a powerful reminder that the most significant battles are often fought not in war rooms, but in everyday places where prejudice is allowed to fester. It shows how one person's courage can trigger an avalanche of accountability, exposing systemic rot hidden behind corporate logos and plastic name tags. The karma that came for Brenda and her enablers wasn't just satisfying. It was a necessary cleansing, a painful but vital correction. It proves that ignorance and hate, when challenged by integrity and relentless professionalism, will always crumble. Thank you for joining us on this journey today. In a world that can sometimes feel divided, it's the simple acts of kindness and compassion that remind us of our shared humanity. Justice is not just a lofty ideal. It begins with each small choice we make to stand up, to listen, and to care. Every gentle word, every brave action has the power to change lives and light a path forward. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with others and to stay connected by subscribing to Kind Light Stories. Together we can keep the flame of hope alive. As the poet Mary Oliver once said, "Instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it." Thank you for being part of that story.